Friends, today is Friday, the 25th of September. We're back in the cathedral, just celebrated Mass, kind of a dark and gloomy day. Typical of fall in Oregon, a little wet, a little cool, and a change of seasons. And that, in a sense, reminds me of today's first reading from the book of Ecclesiastes, the time for this season, that season, a time to be born, a time for that, a time to plant, a time to reap, and so on. Yesterday we were introduced to the book of Ecclesiastes, and is sometimes called the Book of Koheleth. And I mentioned to you that it's one of the latest books of the Old Testament, written shortly before the birth of Jesus. And one of my professors in school described it as bringing the Old Testament to its final frontier. I think I used that word, frontier. It brings it almost to a wall, and it stops. Because it does not have within it the capacity to bring salvation. It's always looking ahead, looking forward. But with Koheleth, we kind of bring ourselves to a dead end. Where does it go from here? I mentioned yesterday that the book, even though the poetry of the book is beautiful, it really is a fatalistic and pessimistic view of life. Life and the world as a circle that keeps turning and turning and turning. Remember the song from the 60s, was it? Maybe early 70s, Turn, Turn, Turn by the Byrds. Everybody had that kind of beautiful image of that song and the seasons and life and death and peace and war and so on. No one really stopped to say, well, what does it all mean? And what it meant was, we're caught in this system and we cannot break out. It keeps turning and turning and turning, but it's going nowhere. We're hitting a dead end. We're hitting a dead end. And yet in the reading today, despite the fact that everything seems to be determined in a fatalistic kind of way, God placed into our hearts a hope. A hope that all of humanity hoped for from creation itself, that one day a Savior would come. And it said in the reading today that God has put the timeless into our hearts. Even though we're stuck in time, God has put the timeless into our hearts. And so we look ahead, and we look ahead with hope. And that brings us to today's gospel, which is a wonderful counterpart to that first reading. Jesus, it says, is alone in a deserted place, although he is somehow with his disciples. Jesus was praying in solitude with his disciples. So they're in a deserted place, and Jesus is praying, the disciples with them. Whenever Jesus is praying, in particular in the Gospel of Luke here, we know that something important is about to happen. And thus Jesus presents two questions to the disciples. Who do people say that I am? And there's some agreement that Jesus is some kind of prophet. But then he makes it personal. And who do you say that I am? And Peter is the first to respond, and the first to recognize, the first person to recognize Jesus as the Messiah, the one hoped for, that one who the hope placed in our hearts is fulfilled in the person of Jesus. He said, you are the Christ. You are the Christ of God. Christ being the Greek word for Messiah. You are the Christ. Peter recognizes in Jesus the one who is to come. That even though the Old Testament does not contain within it the capacity for salvation, it looked ahead. And so many quotes, was it St. Jerome who said, the Christ is present on every page of the Old Testament. And now that Christ has appeared, has broken into the world, the kingdom has broken in. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because the Lord has anointed me to bring glad tidings to the poor. And that's all of us, glad tidings to the poor. When the kingdom breaks into the world, that dead end of Koheleth and Ecclesiastes is broken. And that cycle, that circle, unending in which we are caught, is now broken. And Jesus present to us. And yet he comes to us in a way that was unexpected, even though the prophet Isaiah spoke of the suffering servant. Jesus says that before you make any conclusions, remember, he says that the Son of Man must suffer greatly and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed and raised on the third day. The sacrifice of Jesus, because the depravity of humanity was so great, salvation needed a divine sacrifice. The Son of God sacrificed on the cross for us to bring us salvation and new life. Every time we celebrate the Eucharist, we celebrate that salvation, the longing of all people for a Savior. The Savior has come, died, and rose, broken that cycle, that endless cycle. And now we live in that new light. And of course, we need to live that salvation, to live as people who have been saved. Part of the difficulty in life today in our Catholics and Christians in general is we don't recognize the need for the Savior. We think we can do it ourselves with our we're smart, we're intelligent, we can do anything. And we think we don't need a Savior. Only when we recognize the need of a Savior will the effects of this salvation take root in us. And we will begin to live as true Christians, as good Catholics. Hold that thought and give thanks for the salvation we have received. And we'll see you tomorrow.